Thanks for bearing with me, everybody. Appreciate it. Okay. There we go. All right. Hopefully everybody can see my slides. If not, let me know in the chat or come off mute. And let's get started. So today we'll be talking about the fiscal year 2026 ACEP-ALE, or the Agricultural Conservation Easement, Agricultural Land Easement Program from NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service. We'll be doing an application workshop, and my name is Matt Penberthy. I'm the ALE Program Coordinator. I work with the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts in partnership with the Natural Resources Conservation Service in Oregon. And I'm also joined by Carson Kendrick, our Conservation Program Director. Do you want to say hi real quick, Carson?
Sure. Good morning, guys. Lovely to be here. Thanks, Matt, for putting this together. And yeah, I'll be monitoring the chat as questions come in.
Yes, thanks, Carson. Yeah, so if there's any questions, we will have time for Q&A throughout the presentation, but if there's any questions, burning questions you have, feel free to put those in the chat. Okay, so again, as a reminder, welcome. This webinar will be recorded and available on COLT's website in a couple of days here once we get it posted. And just a little bit about COLT, the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts. We serve and strengthen the land trust community in Oregon, and we primarily do that by building connections and advancing policies that help protect our natural world. And basically our services, we help to keep our land trust members and other members like soil and water conservation districts, other partners, we help keep them doing what they do best, stewarding land and providing public access, et cetera, et cetera. We have a number of services, including a pro bono program for our members, so we provide legal advice. We host the Oregon Land Justice Program, so we help facilitate relationship building with Indigenous communities and tribes. And a large part of our work is also policy advocacy, which is Carson's area of the COLT organization. So today, as I mentioned, we'll be talking about the ACEP-ALE program. You might hear me say ALE or ALE. Just know that all those variations are talking about the same thing. And today we'll be giving a workshop to prospective entity applicants. So that includes easement holders like land trusts, soil and water conservation districts, tribes, and governments. We'll cover just general information about the ALE program, how to apply for the upcoming application submission date. There, of course, are a lot of details with this program, as with any federal program. So there are some specific things like buy, protect, sell, and the minimum deed terms that we won't discuss in depth today, but there are resources available to learn more and are referenced throughout this presentation and linked as well. So you'll receive a copy of the slides with those links. Today, we'll specifically be covering some program basics and then FY26 specific information. We'll go over eligibility. So for both your entity, the land and landowner eligibility requirements. I'll give an overview of ranking criteria, and then we'll pause for question and answer, probably about 5 to 10 minutes. And then we'll talk about submitting an application. I'll go over the process, the general kind of application process timeline, and then we'll have more time for question and answer at the end. All right, so moving into the meat, we'll cover program basics and FY26 information first. So the overall purpose of the ACEP-ALE program is to protect ag uses and future viability and related conservation values of eligible land by limiting those non-ag uses of the land. NRCS can provide up to 50% of the funding for the purchase of agricultural land easements. And just note that there is a program option available called Grasslands of Special Environmental Significance, or GSS. That this is an option where NRCS can provide up to 75% of the funding of purchase of an easement that meets more stringent GSS eligibility requirements. And we will talk about that in more detail today. NRCS does require matching funds. So these are funds from the entity for the remainder of the easement value. So sources of that match may include philanthropic foundation grants, private donations, a landowner donation of the land value, or state government grants like the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program. And this is a note about buy, protect, sell. So this is a ALE transaction type whereby the easement holder, the entity, purchases land, they place an easement on the land, and then they sell the land to a qualified farmer or rancher with the easement in place. This transaction does have unique eligibility requirements in addition to standard ALE transactions, which we won't talk about in this presentation in detail. All right, so for the FY26 specific information, this is in relation to the application cutoff date. We do accept, NRCS does accept applications on a continuous basis, but we typically set cutoff dates to batch applications each fiscal year. And this process helps enable the state offices that are responsible for processing the applications to align those with national timelines, as well as funds assessments, which I'll talk about in just a second, and EAB service timelines. The EAB stands for the Easement Acquisitions Branch. They are a branch that works above kind of a national level to review all of Oregon's applications. So to be considered for FY26 funding, the application cutoff date is Thursday, January 15th at 5 p.m. PST, Pacific Standard Time. The date this year is set nationally, so across all states, to submit an application for ACEP-ALE, it has to be in by January 15th. The states can individually set later cutoff dates as well after this first one if there is a need for that or if there's more funding available. So for right now, this is the first date that Oregon is working with. We did just receive our allocation for the program as well. We received just over 2.2 million, which is an increase from previous fiscal years. The ACEP program overall at the national budget has increased due to funding being rescinded from Inflation Reduction Act funds last year and moving into the general ACEP funding bucket. So we should see a trend of either the same or increased amounts to Oregon for ACEP-ALE in the next couple of fiscal years. There is a process by which NRCS Oregon can receive additional funding throughout the fiscal year. It's called the funds assessment that National conducts, and the dates of which NRCS has to submit additional funds requests. The first date is April 3rd, and then the second date is June 5th. And if you have more questions about that process, happy to talk more about that separately. We won't be covering that in detail today. And just to note, as there might be questions about, the government shutdown that just happened, and then the risk of one happening in January, just note that USDA is funded for the entire fiscal year through September 31st, 2026. So there is minimal to no risk of kind of the application processing being interrupted this fiscal year. Okay, diving into eligibility, we will first cover entity eligibility, then land and landowner eligibility. So entity eligibility, the ACEP-ALE program requires an entity, like I've mentioned, it could be a land trust, an SWCD, a tribe, or others, to be eligible to participate in the program. Entity eligibility is recognized by establishing a program agreement, and we'll talk about the program agreement requirements later. But for the purpose of the program, the entity applies, they acquire the easement, and manage the easement in perpetuity. So the eligibility requirements for entities are first to be an agency of a state or local government, a native nation, or a nonprofit, non-governmental organization. They must be organized for the purpose of land preservation, and this can include a number of different preservation purposes as listed. They must also have authority by law to purchase or hold ag conservation easements. They must have an established ag land protection program that purchases conservation easements. They must have a demonstrated commitment to the long-term conservation of ag lands, and those two, 4 and 5, are kind of intrinsically tied together, but they are listed separately. And then I have some more eligibility requirements on the next slide here. The entity must also have the capability to acquire, manage, and enforce the ag land easement. They must have staff capacity as well, dedicated to monitoring and easement stewardship. They must be able to satisfy the non-federal share requirements. So in a couple slides ago, I talked about the match requirements. They must be registered with the Farm Service Agency, registered with the System of Award Management, or SAM. That's the way to generate a unique entity identifier, or UEI number. And you must have signature authority properly identified. I know that was a lot, and we'll go through all the documentation to satisfy entity eligibility requirements later on in the presentation. And again, you'll have all these slides to reference after the presentation. Jumping into land eligibility. So the land must be private or tribal land that is agricultural land, such as a farm or ranch. And the land must be currently in one of the following uses. So it must be cropland, rangeland, grassland, or land that contains forbs, shrubs for which grazing is the predominant use. The land must be located in an area that has been historically dominated by grass, forbs, or shrubs, or it could also be non-industrial private forest land that contributes to the economic viability of the parcel or serves as a buffer to protect land from development. Further land eligibility requirements, there are kind of 4 categories or pathways to enter into the ALE program. And I recommend that you choose the category that best fits the land and the landowner's goals. So the first category is the land has prime, unique, or farmland of statewide important soils. Second category is the land contains historical or archaeological resources. Third category is enrolling the land would protect grazing uses or related conservation values. And the fourth category is protecting the land will further a state or local policy consistent with the purposes of ACEP. And I do have a note here that this could be an option if the land does not meet the previous 3 categories. Specifically in Oregon, given our statewide land use regulations that are likely consistent with ACEP, we haven't had an application come in for this 4th category, at least in my recent knowledge. So there is not precedent yet if our statewide land use regulations are consistent, but it might be a good kind of catch-all if none of the other categories fit for your land and landowner. And some additional notes, the land must also have a written pending offer from the entity for the purchase of the easement. It must face development pressure from non-ag uses. It must also be in an area with access to ag markets or infrastructure. And lastly, and importantly, the land must have sufficient physical and legal access. So if the land is only accessible by federal lands or roads, alternative legal access approval is likely required. And we recommend you talk to NRCS early about this if you know that your land is kind of entirely surrounded or landlocked by federal lands. We can kind of work through that process before you apply, ideally. As with entity eligibility requirements, all of the documentation to satisfy land eligibility requirements are described in the slides ahead. So hold on tight, we'll get there. A little bit further on a specific ALE program option, the grasslands of special environmental significance. Starting off with the definition here, GSS are grasslands that contain little or no noxious or invasive species. They are also subject to the threat of conversion to non-grassland uses. And the land is range, pasture, shrub, or wet meadows on which the vegetation is dominated by native grasses or grass-like plants, shrubs, or it could also be improved or naturalized pasture, range, or wet meadows. And the land is providing or could provide habitat for threatened and endangered or at-risk species, and a number of other descriptions there as well. Further, GSS does not allow forest land or cropland, even if either are used for grazing purposes. This clarification is important because in recent years, there's been a bit more scrutiny on the national level of GSS enrollments. And so Oregon is working to set further GSS qualifications that fit within the GSS policy. So specifically on the definition you saw that it can have little or no noxious or invasive species. So we've set a definition here, and I have a typo, I meant to say noxious instead of non-native. Invasive or noxious species may not exceed 10% on the offered easement area. And additionally, there's been some issues with forest land as well. So to clarify, forest land acres are generally not eligible. And we have further set that pine tree encroachment or invasive juniper presence in Eastern Oregon may not exceed 5% of the offered easement area. And in Western Oregon, oak presence on savanna in Western Oregon may not exceed 20% of the offered easement area. So some tips on applying to GSS, as it does involve more kind of staff review and more eligibility requirements. The first thing is to utilize a new GSS priority area map developed by NRCS Oregon. I'm very excited to be sharing both the previous slide and this map with you all. This process has been a year in the making, just about, and has been a major collaboration with local staff from NRCS, the state office staff, and some folks from the West Tech National Center. This map will be available as a PDF and as a shapefile on the NRCS Oregon webpage. And this map is not used to determine eligibility. So if you're looking at an area of land and it's not within the blue areas, that doesn't mean that it's not eligible. It just means that based on the best data available at this time, these are the areas that Oregon is working to prioritize, and it may be a useful communication tool for you all, for entities to go out and target specific landowners that are within these blue areas. We also recommend that you meet with state office easement staff early and discuss your project, and therefore from there, the NRCS staff can begin coordinating on-site GSS determination. As for in Oregon, we do a specific GSS site visit with our local staff to determine eligibility. And as a general recommendation, definitely follow the instructions within the parcel application packet, which we'll talk about later in this presentation, just to make sure you're answering all the questions accurately and to the best of your knowledge. All right, landowner eligibility requirements and the Farm Service Agency, or FSA. So for landowners, the land must be owned by an individual or an entity. So in this case, the entity is a farm business, not the easement holder, or a tribe. If not, they must have a current written purchase agreement to buy the land. All producers and or entities, so that may include a trust or a farm business like an LLC. They must have FSA records established and meet the eligibility requirements. So some of that filed paperwork includes the CCC 902 or the Farm Operating Plan, potentially the 901 as well. All landowners must also file the CCC 941, the Adjusted Gross Income Certification, and also the AD 1026, which is generally the Conservation Compliance Certification. Just want to highlight some resources available here. So there are partners that have developed some very good resources that are in plain language that I use all the time, including the American Farmland Trust Entity Toolkit. They have also a specific landowner eligibility checklist, kind of walk through these documents. And the Land Trust Alliance also has an entity toolkit to learn about the program overall. Some tips and tricks about FSA eligibility. There can be some quirky situations such as recent business changes or entity member scenarios, maybe some geospatial issues as well. And some tips to address these include you can contact myself with your landowner information. I can work to give you direction on addressing specific eligibility needs. That involves looking at entity eligibility, so getting down to the LLC, the general partnership, limited partnership levels, and looking at the specific members of those entities as well. And then I'll also take a look at the geospatial easement boundary compared with FSA farm and tracts, which is the way that FSA basically registers every farm in the nation. They have a geospatial system that they use, and they delineate tract numbers to specific fields. And then from there, you would communicate any needs with your landowner, and you could either work with your landowner and help coordinate with FSA, or have the landowner work individually with FSA to resolve any of these eligibility needs. And I do want to highlight, since there's a lot of info on this slide, that it is not NRCS's responsibility to process FSA paperwork or make eligibility determinations. And also want to highlight that your working relationship with FSA is important. They are a busy agency, so please have patience and address things early. And please reach out to NRCS staff if you need any assistance. We can possibly find some workarounds or connect to folks that are available at the state level versus the county level. All right, so getting into considerations and ineligibility. So I know I talked about non-industrial private forest land. For the general ALE easements, the forest land may not exceed 2/3 of the offered easement area, though there is an option to submit a waiver. And also, impervious surfaces may not exceed more than 2% of the offered easement area. And there is another waiver option available. For ineligibility, all these factors are in addition to the landowner, and entity eligibility requirements that I just went over. So the first point is that land cannot be already owned by a federal, state, or local government or a non-governmental organization. Land cannot be subject to an easement deed or a deed restriction that already provides similar protection. Land where the purposes of the program would be undermined due to on-site or off-site conditions like hazardous material is also ineligible. Land that NRCS determines to have unacceptable exceptions to clear title or insufficient legal access is ineligible. And then land on which essentially like third-party mineral rights are leased or owned by someone other than the landowner, unless NRCS determines that these rights will not harm or interfere with achieving the purposes of the easement. Okay, we're getting into ranking criteria, and then we'll pause for any questions, and then I can take a sip of water as well. So for ranking criteria, NRCS uses these criteria to select applications for funding that are best aligned with program goals. There are approximately 14 nationally determined questions. Each specific question is assigned a total amount of points that can sum up to 200 at a minimum. And then there are roughly 12 state determined questions, so NRCS Oregon determined questions. These questions can be assigned points that total up to 200 at a maximum. So overall, when you submit an application, we'll review it for eligibility, then we'll rank it, and your application in that ranking can earn up to 400 points total. Unfortunately, with just delays and the shutdown, the ranking criteria is not yet available. So we are waiting. NRCS Oregon is waiting for national to revamp their portion of the ranking. There should be very minimal changes. And then I'll talk about Oregon's changes in a moment, but once it is available, it will be posted on the NRCS Oregon webpage in the section that I included in the screenshot there. And then just to highlight some of our changes, each fiscal year, NRCS reviews the latest information pertaining to ranking criteria, and we may update state-determined questions. We did update several state-determined questions for this fiscal year, FY26. We made small clarifications to ensure proper definitions and terminology are used. And then we also simplify some questions that were kind of confusing or asked two questions in one. We added habitat qualifiers to questions that regarding parcels with sage grouse or oak habitat priority areas. So the question is not just if a parcel falls within the ODFW sage grouse kind of priority areas. Does it fall within it, and does it contain or will it be restored to maintain habitat beneficial to sage grouse? And then we also have a new question about entity closing efficiency of ALEs. And when we talk about the parcel application packet later on, you'll kind of see where this ranking criteria comes into play in the packet. So we'll discuss in more detail soon. All right, so I just want to pause here for a moment. If there's any initial or burning questions, I'll stop sharing so I can see folks. And if not, then we'll move on. And I need some water.
I've got a question, Matt.
Hey, Amy, yeah, go ahead.
You briefly mentioned BiProtect Cell and that you were not going to cover that in this presentation. Are you going to do another workshop or presentation specifically about that by chance?
I'd like to. It's been on my kind of like work plan since I started. That program is a bit more complicated and does involve more specific eligibility requirements that I just need to get more information on first, to be frank. And there are trainings that NRCS National has put on about those. So I'll kind of collect those and can share them out as well. But I do plan with certainly next year. I'm just not sure if it'll be within the first half or the second half of the year.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah. Thanks, Mick. I see your question in the chat. Any chance we can get a copy of the GSS map? Yes, so it will be posted on the NRCS Oregon webpage for ACEP-ALE, and it'll be in the PDF version and a shapefile version. So you can upload it to a GIS software and maybe do some further analysis or looking at specific properties with it. All right. I'm going to jump back into the presentation just for time. I've still got probably about 20 more minutes talking at you. Let's see the screen. Sorry, one second. Okay, looks like presentation. Oops. Okay, looks like it's up. Thanks for those questions again. Yeah, let's jump into submitting an application. So we'll first talk about an entity application to establish a program agreement. If you already have a program agreement, you can maybe ignore these next couple slides, but it might be relevant in the future as program agreements are only active for 5 fiscal years, and I know a number are expiring next year. So the entities or the easement holder must be determined eligible themselves and have a program agreement before an individual parcel contract can be established. The program agreements essentially set out the responsibilities for NRCS and the eligible entity. There's no funds that get obligated to a program agreement. Funding is only obligated to a parcel contract. And if you're unsure if your organization has an active program agreement for ACEP-ALE, you can contact the general easement inbox here. So the required materials for a program agreement application include a CPA 41, that's like a standardized national form that's used. For nonprofits, you would provide the legal documents that designate your organization's charity status, purpose, and service area. This can include either the articles of incorporation, your bylaws, or some other specific board policies. For state or local governments, that you would provide the state or local law that established your agency. And for federally recognized tribes, you would provide the latest Federal Register notice that lists your tribe. Or for non-federally recognized tribes, you may qualify as a nonprofit organization. The 5th item here, you'd provide proof of authority to hold conservation easements. This is essentially just a copy of the Oregon revised statute that talks about conservation easements and their holders. You provide proof of an established land protection program. So this can include a variety of sources like a conservation plan, an annual report, web page, or a board policy like a land acquisition policy. That's the one we typically see as a land acquisition policy. You provide proof of registration with FSA, and NRCS can essentially pull this document unless your entity is not already registered. Then we could kind of help coordinate getting you set up with FSA. And you'd provide proof of SAM registration. So again, that's the System of Award Management, and your unique entity identifier, or UEI. So you would just provide a screenshot of your current, not expired SAM profile with that UEI number visible. It's usually a combination of letters and numbers. And you provide proof of signature authority. So this can include a board governance policy that outlines who could sign, or maybe a specific board resolution or a hiring letter identifying specific individuals, like an executive director. And again, there's resources to learn more about entity eligibility, including both those general toolkits that I mentioned from American Farmland Trust and Land Trust Alliance. But American Farmland Trust also has an entity eligibility checklist to walk you through each of these items. And LTA also has a CPA 41 walkthrough for that specific form. All right, moving into the parcel application. So this is what's used to determine the eligibility of the specific piece of land, the landowners, and collect information to help NRCS write applications. NRCS National has specified that there's a minimum required documentation that comprise a complete application, but just note that complete does not equal eligible. This includes a completed CPA 41A, a recorded property deed, an executed purchase and sale agreement, or other evidence of ownership. It also includes maps or GIS shapefiles of the parcel location, offered acres, and access. And lastly, a written pending offer between the landowner and eligible entity to acquire the easement. Note that NRCS will begin processing the application in the system of record upon the receipt of these materials. But importantly, NRCS Oregon does require additional documentation to determine eligibility and rank the application, as we'll get into all these details on the next slides. First, I want to cover just an overview of the 41A. This is the standard national application. used for all ALE transaction types. So it kind of collects just the basic information about the potential easement. And some tips and tricks to fill this out are to make sure to select the correct enrollment type or transaction type. So that transaction type is either like a standard ALE or a by protect cell, sorry. And the enrollment type would be a general ALE versus the GSS. Make sure to select the correct land eligibility category. So those 4 categories we talked about a number of slides ago. And make sure to provide accurate easement acreage to the best of your knowledge. And if you're enrolling the entire parcel, ensure that that acreage matches FSA records. And also provide location coordinates on within the proposed easement area, not touching or like just adjacent to. And this last one is probably the most important, is to provide the best estimate of easement value. So within reason, we do recommend to overestimate your easement value to avoid any future contract modifications. This is especially true if there's not an appraisal already, which is typically the case. I wouldn't expect, I haven't seen an entity come in with an appraisal already at the time of application. And this is because it's easy for NRCS to return excess funds if you overestimate, but it's difficult for NRCS to obtain additional funding if you come in lower or at the value you think it is, and then the appraisal actually comes in higher later on. It's hard for NRCS to get more funding. So now moving into Oregon requirements, I'll talk about all the details on the upcoming slides that we request. But I first just want to give quick tidbits as to why. So we request additional information upfront to efficiently process applications with limited staff. It's essentially just myself and my supervisor working on ALE. So the previous 4 documents that I just talked about tell us very little about the project. So in order to efficiently determine eligibility and rank the applications, it's really helpful to submit the documentation that we'll talk about in a moment. And it also helps reduce additional requests for information and potential miscommunications between NRCS and the entity staff in meeting program deadlines. So a tip I have here is to follow the ACEP-ALE timeline guide. This is a new resource that I just produced this year, and it could help begin resolving eligibility issues prior to application. This guide is now available online at the link here, and I'll talk about it as well in the upcoming slides. So for Oregon's requirements, we primarily use a parcel application packet specific to each fiscal year. So this form collects information to determine eligibility and help us rank the application. It includes an introduction letter, which has helpful info about the program, tips to complete the packet, FSA eligibility requirements, and more. It also includes an application checklist. So this outlines the required and supplemental forms and information needed for a complete application. It also provides naming convention for required documents. So if you follow that, that's super helpful for me in organizing all of our files. If you don't do it, I'll just rename it on my end, so no worries, but would help a lot if you use that naming convention. And then the meat of the packet is a parcel questionnaire. So it contains about 70 or 80 questions that are a mixture of multiple choice or short answer. I know that number sounds like a lot, but you likely do not end up answering many of those questions depending on your project. There are certain sections that you fill out if for certain eligibility requirements, depending on the land and the landowner you're working with. So don't be too intimidated by that. And then there are appendices. So there's information on how to submit your application. There's definitions for the program, how to use web soil survey, and even answers to questions and more. So I want to highlight some parcel application packet updates here. So each fiscal year, we may update the parcel application packet to ensure that it's aligned with not only eligibility requirements, but also ranking updates. And some specific updates in FY26 include a number of questions that are now simplified. So we had, as an example, we had 3 succession planning questions that were now reduced to 1 question in FY26. And there are some questions that were expanded upon. So we did that to mainly align with changes to FY26 ranking criteria. So as I kind of highlighted before, the questions about sage grouse in particular, we have that habitat qualifier. So if it falls within the sage grouse priority area map, does it actually provide beneficial habitat for sage grouse? And if you come upon any question and you're confused about it, please reach out for help, and we can help you provide the best information that you can for your project. I do want to highlight a couple of more updates, including updates to the historical or archaeological section. So the gist is here is if you're applying for the historical or archaeological land eligibility category, which is not something we see frequently. I don't think we've ever had an application for this category yet. So if you're applying to this category and or the parcel contains these resources that you would like to have considered for ranking points, please read and complete this section as it now contains updated and important information. I won't get into all the details here. None of the underlying program policy changed related to this section, but the way that we ask questions about it to ensure that you all fill this out correctly has changed a little. So please, if you would like to either apply for this category and or earn ranking points, please read this section. We've updated the subdivision section, so we've added descriptions of subdivision options that were not included in the packet before, and we included a question to indicate which option, if allowed, the applicants are selecting, if you're allowing subdivision in the easement terms. And we've edited the entity performance section. So we previously had you all answer these questions, but we simply revised them to just give you information about entity performance rather than a question, because basically we just calculate these metrics during the ranking process. And I've updated some of the appendices as well. So we removed an old appendix that wasn't needed, and I replaced it with some more answers to the US Census-based questions. All right, so moving into the supplemental documentation that is required. This information is located on the checklist within the parcel application packet. And so in addition to the 4 minimally required documents on slide 25 and the parcel application packet, we also require an evidence of an active SAM registration, current signature authority documentation as it may change over the years, title commitment or preliminary title commitment, and underlying exception docs. So that can either be linked within the document as hyperlinks, or if you want to save those separately and provide them in specific folders or just as separate files, that's also helpful. And then there are maps required. So preferably in a PDF version, the GIS shapefiles are acceptable, but not required. The maps are described in full in the parcel application packet. The 4 ones that are required are the proposed easement boundary, the access map, public land survey system or PLSS, and a land cover map. And these are all separate. It's not all one map, so 4 separate maps. And an important note here is that there are additional required documents that are required if they apply to your project. So as you fill out the parcel application packet, please be sure to read through the checklist and the specific questions to understand what documents are required when applicable and which are optional. Quick note about mapping guidance. The easement acquisitions branch, as I mentioned before, they review all of Oregon's applications, and they've developed guidance to establish consistency for NRCS services. as maps are a communication tool, and if they are not labeled well or missing information, we may come back with a request for information and request some revisions. And this is largely because your maps are used to order NRCS due diligence products, such as the environmental database record search. So please follow the guidance included as an appendix to the parcel application packet for all maps. I'm not going to go through the list here, but this is the appendix. So it includes an example map that EAB created, and then a list of all the elements that should be included. So congrats, you've filled out your application. I'm sure you all did that in the time of this presentation because it's super easy. That is sarcastic, but now it's time to submit. So option 1 and our preferred option is to upload via Box. So this kind of works like Google Drive. There's a few organizations that already have a Box link. So if you don't have one already, please contact myself or the general easement inbox there to request a Box folder for your organization. And option 2 is to email the application to our easement inbox. And there are some detailed submission instructions included in the parcel application packet. It includes some information on how to use Box or how to format the email when you send it to NRCS. All right, I'll quickly cover the application process overview. So this originates from the ACEP-ALE timeline guide. This is a new resource, as I mentioned, where the purpose is to provide chronological guidance from pre-application to obligation of NRCS easement funding. The guide's now available on our website as a PDF. And I also gave a recorded presentation back in August about it, actually. So you can refer to that presentation as well. We're going to start out with the application phase. So we're already past pre-application, and I understand you're probably looking at this and seeing the months a little bit misaligned to where we are now. Obviously, that's due to the shutdown, but moving forward, I'm quite confident that this is the ideal timeline, and if not, I will update the guide moving forward. So here we are in the application phase. Yes, the application will be due in January, so we can just picture that this says January instead. But at this time, the entity submits their application to the state office. The batching end date is and will be in the future typically set for November/early December, but it is changed this year, of course, due to the shutdown, like I just mentioned. From there, the state office easement staff may contact entity applicants in January or earlier regarding eligibility items needed before processing the application further. And your application must be eligible before we get to ranking. And there's typically a ranking deadline set internally, set either by the state or at the national level in the same fiscal year. So I'm not sure off the top of my head what that is. I think we're still waiting for the guidance, but I can double check after. So please consult with the state office easement staff for the most current information. That date off the top of my head is usually around March or April. And then depending on the timing of your application submission and whether the state office easement staff may schedule an on-site eligibility visit. So this will include the environmental site assessment for hazardous materials at the time you submit your application. Moving into the second year, NRCS Oregon's easement staff may communicate there are eligibility needs, and if there are needs, continue to work with NRCS and your landowner to resolve those eligibility needs. Then we'll move into ranking the applications. And then once eligible and ranked applications are identified for funding, the state office easement staff will submit essentially a request to the easement acquisitions branch to review the application. EAB will conduct a full review of the application, and the NRCS Oregon State Office will work with EAB to address any eligibility items as needed. At this time, if there's any comments that the state office cannot address without more information from the entity applicant, we may reach out at any point for further information. Once those items are addressed, EAB can then submit the application to national headquarters to conduct another review called the pre-obligation internal controls review. And there is a national instruction that describes more about this review process if you're interested. There is an internal deadline typically set for mid-August for the final submission for this review. And then once the application is reviewed and approved by headquarters, the parcel contract gets generated and signed by the entity's authorized signatory and the state conservationist. So from there, the obligation, moving into obligation is relatively short process. It's essentially just signing the parcel contracts, and NRCS will tie funding to your application and parcel contract by mid-September. And then moving into acquisition, there isn't a clear timeline for this yet, as it depends on project complexity. And so from there, EAB becomes the project lead. They'll send you a copy of the parcel contract and the next steps letter, and then they may hold an introductory meeting with you to review the easement acquisition process and timelines. And then this is the general list of items needed to close your easement. Briefly cover some resources. So first you have NRCS Oregon staff. That includes Eric Mogenberg, my supervisor. He's the easement programs manager. And myself, I'm also available. I assist with all aspects of ACEP-ALE. And sorry, I forgot to explain, WRE is the wetlands reserve easement that is just with NRCS and landowners. So Eric works on that program. And then the RCPP is the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, and EHE is entity health easements. That's another easement option. And both of us work on that program. Also want to highlight the Land Trust Alliance. They have an NRCS conservation acquisition team. They offer one-on-one assistance to work with entity applicants on all aspects of their application. They do prioritize land trusts with minimal experience with NRCS programs, whether that's an individual staff person or as an organization overall. And you can submit your requests at the link provided here. And if you haven't heard back, feel free to contact myself or Josh Holmes, who works with LTA. And these are just another summary of the resources that I provided already in this presentation. We have the entity ALE toolkit, both one from American Farmland Trust and from the Land Trust Alliance. And American Farmland Trust also has a landowner specific toolkit from a landowner perspective. Okay, I made it through. On to another question and answer, and then we'll wrap it up. Again, feel free to come off mute or raise your hand. And no worries if there's no questions. I know it's a lot of information, kind of jam-packed it within the hour here. But very much appreciate everybody for joining. As we mentioned, this presentation will be shared out, the slides and the recording. And yeah, just thanks again for your time. The official announcement too, so NRCS Oregon is currently waiting for national to make their official announcement about the batching period. So that's why you may not have seen an NRCS Oregon announcement saying, hey, we're taking applications by January 15th. Please apply today. Just note that that will be coming relatively soon. All right.
Thanks, Matt.
We'll wrap it up then. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Carson.